Have you ever wondered how a single decision can alter the fate of future generations? Amid the ashes of Sodom and Gomorrah, a nation is born, one whose story weaves through the pages of the Bible as a testament to tragic choices and lasting consequences. The Moabites, a people born of incest, marked by idolatry, and destined to be both enemies and a part of the very lineage of the Messiah. Imagine a dark night in a lonely cave, where two desperate women make a decision that will echo for thousands of years. From the depths of this morally questionable choice, Moab emerges, and with him, a nation that will challenge Israel, worship bloodthirsty idols, and yet through Ruth become intertwined with the very genealogy of Jesus Christ. From broken alliances to epic battles, from prophetic curses to unexpected redemption, the story of the Moabites is a biblical drama that confronts us with questions about identity, divine providence, and the paradox of grace flourishing in unlikely soil. Get ready for a journey through the plains of Moab, where sin and redemption dance in a story that continues to teach us about the complexity of the human experience under God's watchful eye. The history of the Moabites begins after one of the most devastating events recorded in the Bible, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot, Abraham's nephew, had chosen to live in Sodom, a city infamous for its wickedness and corruption. When God decided to destroy these cities due to their depravity, he sent angels to rescue Lot and his family. In Genesis 19, we read that Lot and his two daughters managed to escape, initially seeking refuge in the small town of Zoar. However, fearing for their safety, they soon left and took shelter in a cave in the mountains, an isolated place, far from civilization. Having witnessed the complete destruction of the cities in the plain, Lot's daughters mistakenly believed that they and their father were the only survivors on earth. Concerned about the continuation of their lineage and with no prospects of finding husbands, they made a desperate and morally reprehensible decision. On 2 consecutive nights, Lot's daughters intoxicated their father with wine, taking advantage of his unconscious state to lie with him. As a result of these incestuous unions, both conceived sons. The elder daughter bore a son and named him Moab, a name that literally means "from the father," leaving no ambiguity about the child's origins. This Moab became the patriarch and founder of the Moabite nation. Over time, Moab's descendants multiplied and settled in the region east of the Dead Sea. This area, later known as the Land of Moab, was strategically located and rich in natural resources, which allowed the Moabite nation to develop. The first Moabite settlements appeared in fertile valleys and plains, where they cultivated crops and raised livestock. Gradually, they formed more stable communities, built villages that grew into cities, and established a distinct cultural identity, separate from their neighboring peoples. The land of Moab was geographically diverse and strategically positioned. Located east of the Dead Sea, it featured vast, fertile plains that gradually rose into the mountains of the Transjordan Plateau. This varied terrain provided ideal conditions for different types of economic activities. In the plains, the Moabites developed a thriving agricultural economy, cultivating wheat, barley, olives, and vineyards. The highlands, in turn, offered excellent pastures for their flocks of sheep and goats. The abundance of water was ensured by numerous rivers and streams flowing through the region, with the Arnon River being the most significant, serving as a natural border in many periods of history. Moab's geographical position was highly advantageous. Situated between the Arabian Desert to the east and the fertile lands of Canaan to the west, Moab stood at the crossroads of major trade routes connecting Egypt to Mesopotamia and Arabia. This strategic location greatly contributed to the kingdom's wealth through trade and reinforced its political significance in the region. The major Moabite cities were well fortified, with imposing walls that leveraged natural geographical features to enhance their defense capabilities. Among the most important cities were Dibon, Nebo, Medeba, and Ar, the capital. One of the most notable geographical landmarks in Moab was Mount Nebo. According to Deuteronomy 34, it was from this mountain that Moses beheld the Promised Land before he died, unable to enter it. This event gave Mount Nebo a special historical and religious significance, making it an important landmark not only for the Moabites but also within Israelite biblical tradition. Moab's borders shifted throughout history, but generally the kingdom was bordered by Ammon to the north, Edom to the south, and Israel to the west, separated by the Dead Sea. These geographical proximities profoundly influenced Moabite political and religious history, leading to periods of conflict, alliances, and mutual cultural influences. Moabite culture was predominantly agricultural and pastoral. The Moabites were known for their expertise in livestock breeding, particularly sheep and cattle, as well as in wool production and agricultural cultivation. Their proximity to trade routes also allowed them to exchange these goods with merchants from distant lands, obtaining exotic items and developing a relatively prosperous society by the standards of their time. The first significant encounter between the Moabites and the Israelites occurred during the Exodus, when the people of Israel, after escaping Egypt, wandered the desert for 40 years before entering the Promised Land. At the end of this journey, the Israelites arrived at the plains of Moab near the Jordan River, opposite Jericho. As reported in Numbers 21 and 22, when the Israelites approached Moabite territory, they sent messengers to the king of Moab requesting permission to pass through his land. They promised to stay on the main road without straying into the fields or vineyards, and even offered to pay for any water they used during their journey. However, the king of Moab categorically refused their request, forcing the Israelites to bypass his territory. This refusal was not merely an act of hostility, but rather a reflection of deep-seated fear. According to Numbers 22:3, Moab was greatly afraid of the people because they were numerous. Moab was terrified because of the Israelites. News of the Israelites' victories over the Amorites and other peoples had already reached the Moabites, causing genuine panic at the sight of this approaching multitude. Faced with this perceived threat, Balak, the king of Moab, resorted to an unusual tactic. Instead of relying solely on his army, he sent messengers to Balaam, a renowned seer or prophet from Mesopotamia, hiring him to curse the Israelites. At that time, it was believed that blessings or curses pronounced by men like Balaam had real power to influence the fate of nations and peoples. The story of Balaam, detailed in Numbers 22-24, is one of the most intriguing in the Bible. On his journey to meet Balak, Balaam is rebuked by his own donkey, which miraculously speaks after seeing an angel of the Lord blocking the path. This episode serves as a foreshadowing of what is to come. Balaam will only be able to speak the words that God allows him to. Upon arriving in Moab, Balaam is taken by Balak to various high places from where he could see the Israelite camp. At each location, Balak builds altars and offers sacrifices, hoping that Balaam will finally curse Israel. To Balak's growing frustration, instead of curses, Balaam delivers 4 successive oracles, each more favorable to Israel than the last. In his final prophecy, Balaam even foretells the rise of a powerful king in Israel. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. Numbers 24:17, words that would later be interpreted as a messianic reference. The consequences of this prophecy were significant for both nations. For Israel, it was a divine confirmation of their protection and special destiny. For Moab, it was a severe blow to their defensive strategy, leading Balak to resort to more insidious tactics. According to Numbers 25 and 31, the Moabites, following Balaam's own advice, sent their women to seduce Israelite men, leading them into sexual immorality and idolatry. This scheme was temporarily successful. Many Israelites succumbed to temptation, participating in feasts honoring Baal of Peor, a local deity. God's wrath was kindled against Israel, resulting in a plague that killed 24,000 people until it was stopped by Phinehas, the grandson of Aaron. This episode at Peor deeply impacted relations between the two peoples, creating lasting hostility and setting a precedent for future mistrust. The initial interactions between Moabites and Israelites, marked by hostility and seduction into idolatry, had long-term consequences that were reflected in Israel's religious laws. In the books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, we find several specific prohibitions related to the Moabites. Although Leviticus does not explicitly mention the Moabites in its laws of ethnic separation, it establishes general principles of separation between the Israelites and peoples who practiced idolatry. These laws were later specifically applied to the Moabites in Deuteronomy 23:3-6, which states, "No Ammonite or Moabite shall enter the assembly of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation, none of them shall enter the assembly of the Lord forever." This severe prohibition was justified by two main reasons. First, because the Moabites did not offer the Israelites bread and water when they came out of Egypt. Second, because they hired Balaam to curse Israel. The text further states, "You shall not seek their peace or their prosperity all your days forever." The prohibitions included restrictions on intermarriage with Moabites, aiming to prevent foreign religious influence. In ancient times, marriage alliances often involved religious alliances as well, requiring the acceptance of the gods of the spouse's family. To maintain the purity of worship to Yahweh, such unions were discouraged or explicitly forbidden. The theological reasons for these prohibitions were profound. The people of Israel were called to be holy, set apart for God, and to remain distant from the idolatry prevalent among neighboring nations. The Moabites, with their worship of Chemosh and other gods, posed a constant threat to Israel's religious fidelity. It is interesting to note that the treatment of the Moabites in Israelite law was particularly severe compared to other nations. For instance, Edomites, descendants of Esau and Egyptians, could be accepted into the assembly of the Lord after 3 generations, whereas the prohibition for Moabites was forever. In the context of ritual purity, which was crucial in Israel's religious system, ethnic separation was not primarily a matter of race, but of religion and morality. The goal was not ethnic discrimination, but rather the preservation of Israel's religious integrity as a covenant people. The issue of banning Moabites from entering the assembly of the Lord has been interpreted in different ways by scholars. Some understand it as a total exclusion from the religious community, while others see it as merely prohibiting Moabites from holding official positions or participating in certain religious ceremonies. Either way, this prohibition underscored the seriousness with which the Moabite influence was perceived as a threat. Central to the cultural and religious identity of the Moabites was the worship of Chemosh, their national god. In inscriptions and historical references, Chemosh is frequently mentioned as the god of Moab, much like Yahweh was described as the God of Israel. Chemosh was a warrior deity, often associated with destruction and conquest. According to the Mesha Stele, also known as the Moabite stone, an important 9th century BCE archaeological artifact, King Mesha of Moab attributed his military victories to Chemosh. In this inscription, Mesha recounts how Chemosh was angry with his people, allowing them to be subdued by Israel, but later instructed him to reclaim the lost territory. The religious practices associated with the worship of Chemosh were particularly disturbing by Israelite moral standards. Historical evidence and biblical references suggest that the Moabites, like other Canaanite peoples, practiced human sacrifices on extreme occasions. In 2 Kings 3:27, there is a striking account of how the king of Moab, when besieged by the forces, of Israel, Judah, and Edom, took his firstborn son, who was to succeed him as king, and offered him as a burnt offering on the wall. The contrast between the worship of Chemosh and the adoration of Yahweh was profound. While Israelite religion, despite also including animal sacrifices, categorically forbade human sacrifices and emphasized justice, mercy, and moral holiness, Moabite worship, as described in biblical sources, seemed centered on notions of power, domination, and the appeasement of a potentially cruel deity. The negative influence of Chemosh worship on the Israelites is evident in several biblical episodes. In 1 Kings 11:7, we read that King Solomon himself, influenced by his foreign wives, built an altar for Chemosh on the hill east of Jerusalem, a clear violation of the first commandment. This religious syncretism was harshly condemned by the prophets and is presented as one of the causes of eventual divine judgment upon Israel. The relationship between Moabite idolatry and its consequences for their people is a recurring theme in biblical narratives. The prophets often interpreted Moab's military defeats and calamities as a result of their worship of false gods, who were incapable of effectively protecting their worshippers. Archaeological artifacts discovered in the region of Moab provide tangible evidence of Chemosh worship. In addition to the aforementioned Mesha stele, archaeologists have uncovered figurines, altars, and other ritual objects associated with the veneration of this deity. These findings help contextualize and confirm aspects of the biblical narrative. The Moabite stone, discovered in 1868 in Dibon, ancient Dibon, is one of the most important historical records related to the Moabites. This black basalt stele, approximately 115 meters tall, contains an inscription by King Mesha of Moab, celebrating his successful rebellion against Israel. The text, composed in a dialect very close to Hebrew, provides a Moabite perspective on events also recorded in the Bible, particularly in 2 Kings 3, offering a fascinating counterpoint to the biblical narrative. The relations between Moabites and Israelites were marked by tensions and conflicts from their earliest encounters. After Israel's settlement in Canaan, territorial disputes inevitably arose due to geographical proximity and conflicting interests in the region. During the period of the Judges, a time characterized by cycles of apostasy, oppression, repentance, and deliverance in Israel, one of the most significant confrontations between the two peoples took place. According to Judges 3:12-30, the Israelites once again did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and the Lord strengthened Eglon, king of the Moabites, against Israel because they had done evil in the eyes of the Lord. Eglon, described as a very fat man, formed an alliance with the Ammonites and Amalekites, and together they defeated Israel, taking possession of the city of palms, likely Jericho. For 18 years, the Israelites were under Moab's oppressive rule, paying heavy tribute to Eglon. When the Israelites cried out to the Lord, he raised up Ehud, son of Gera, a left-handed Benjamite, to deliver them. The account of how Ehud assassinated Eglon is told in vivid detail in Judges 3. Ehud crafted a double-edged dagger, hid it under his garments on his right side, where guards would be less likely to search, as most men were right-handed, and requested a private audience with the king, claiming to have a secret message for him. When they were alone in the king's summer chamber, Ehud declared, "I have a message from God for you." As Eglon rose from his seat, Ehud drew the dagger with his left hand and plunged it into the king's belly with such force that even the handle went in after the blade and the fat closed over it. Taking advantage of the ensuing confusion, Ehud escaped, gathered the Israelites, and led an attack against the Moabites. The Bible reports that on that day they struck down about 10,000 Moabites, all strong and valiant men. Not one escaped. As a result, Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land had peace for 80 years. This episode established the Arnon River as the boundary between the two territories, a demarcation that would remain significant throughout subsequent history. More importantly, it exemplifies the cycles of domination and deliverance that characterized Israel's relations with its neighbors during the period of the Judges. Conflicts with Moab were not limited to this specific episode. Over the following centuries, there were alternating periods of war, uneasy truces, and one nation dominating the other. These ongoing tensions contributed to the image of Moab as a traditional enemy of Israel in the national consciousness, a theme that repeatedly appears in the prophetic and historical writings of the Bible. Amid the long history of antagonism between the Israelites and the Moabites, a narrative emerges that offers a surprisingly different perspective. The story of Ruth, a Moabite who became an integral part of King David's lineage and consequently of the Messiah himself. The book of Ruth begins by setting the story in the days when the judges ruled, a period of political and moral instability in Israel. A severe famine struck the land of Judah, forcing many families to seek sustenance in neighboring regions. Among these refugees was Elimelech, his wife, Naomi, and their two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, who left Bethlehem to temporarily live in the land of Moab. During their stay in Moab, significant changes occurred within the family. Elimelech passed away, leaving Naomi a widow in a foreign land. However, her two sons integrated into the local society, marrying Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. For about 10 years, they lived this way until another tragedy befell the family. Mahlon and Chilion also died, leaving behind 3 widows, Naomi and her 2 Moabite daughters-in-law. Upon hearing that the famine had ended in Judah, Naomi decided to return to her homeland. Initially, both daughters-in-law insisted on accompanying her, but Naomi urged them to stay in Moab, where they could find new husbands among their own people. After much persuasion, Orpah relented and returned to her parents' home. Ruth, however, demonstrated extraordinary loyalty that transcended both blood ties and nationality. In one of the most moving declarations in biblical literature, she told, "Naomi, do not urge me to leave you or to turn back from following you. For wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you stay, I will stay. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried." This declaration represented more than mere familial loyalty. It was a complete conversion, an abandonment of her former national and religious identity to embrace the people and the God of Israel. This is particularly remarkable considering the historical tensions between the two nations and the Levitical prohibitions previously mentioned. Arriving in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest, Ruth immediately took the initiative to secure sustenance for herself and her mother-in-law by gleaning in the fields, a right granted by Israelite law to the poor and foreigners. Providentially, she ended up in the field belonging to Boaz, a wealthy relative of Elimelech. Impressed by Ruth's reputation as a virtuous and loyal woman, Boaz extended his protection to her, instructing his workers to treat her with respect, and even to deliberately drop extra stalks for her to gather. Gradually, a relationship of mutual respect developed between them. Following Naomi's advice, Ruth approached Boaz at the threshing floor at night, symbolically inviting him to fulfill his role as a kinsman redeemer. Boaz, a man of integrity, acknowledged that there was a closer relative with a prior claim to this right and promised to resolve the matter legally. The next day, Boaz presented the case before the city elders. When the closer relative renounced his claim, Boaz publicly declared his intention to marry Ruth, thus fulfilling the levirate law and ensuring that Elimelech's property remained within the family. From the union of Boaz and Ruth was born Obed, who would become the grandfather of King David. Thus, a Moabite woman became an essential part of the messianic lineage, demonstrating that divine grace transcends ethnic and national barriers. The story of Ruth is often interpreted as a powerful example of how true faith and loyalty can overcome prejudice and historical hostilities. It also illustrates the concept of the faithful remnant among the Gentile nations and foreshadows the future inclusion of Gentiles in God's plan of salvation. With the establishment of the monarchy in Israel, relations with the Moabites entered a new phase. Saul, Israel's first king, pursued a policy of territorial expansion and power consolidation that inevitably brought him into conflict with neighboring kingdoms, including Moab. In 1 Samuel 14:47 we read, "When Saul had secured his kingship over Israel, he fought against all his enemies on every side, against Moab, against the Ammonites, against Edom, against the kings of Zobah, and against the Philistines. Wherever he turned, he inflicted punishment." This brief mention suggests significant military campaigns against the Moabites, though the Bible does not provide as many details about these conflicts as it does for the wars against the Philistines or Amalekites. These campaigns likely aim to secure Israel's eastern borders along the Jordan and possibly to expand control over strategic trade routes. The territorial disputes during this period were probably centered in the Plateau region, east of the Dead Sea, particularly in the lands near the Arnon River, which was traditionally considered the boundary between Israelite and Moabite territories. Controlling these areas was economically significant due to their fertile pastures and strategic position along trade routes. Saul's era was marked by fluid alliances and frequent political betrayals among the various peoples of the region. In this turbulent context, the Moabites likely formed temporary alliances with other enemies of Israel, such as the Ammonites or Edomites, in an attempt to resist Israel's growing hegemony. In fact, there are indications that the Moabites maintained diplomatic relations with other traditional adversaries of Israel. This network of anti-Israelite alliances significantly complicated Saul's strategic situation, forcing him to fight on multiple fronts and imposing practical limits on his ability to completely subjugate any of these kingdoms. As a consequence of Saul's military victories, it is likely that the Moabites were forced to pay tribute to Israel during certain periods of his reign. These tributes typically consisted of agricultural produce, livestock, wool, precious metals, and sometimes even forced labor, placing a considerable economic burden on the Moabite population. However, the borders between the kingdoms remained unstable during this period. Saul's authority was constantly challenged, not only by external enemies, but also by internal issues, including his growing paranoia and conflict with David. This instability created opportunities that the Moabites and other neighboring peoples likely took advantage of to reclaim lost territories or reduce their dependence on Israel whenever possible. Despite Saul's military campaigns, there is no evidence that he managed to establish lasting control over Moab. The relations between the two kingdoms remained tense and ambivalent, setting the stage for significant developments during David's subsequent reign. David's relationship with Moab presents one of the most intriguing paradoxes in biblical history. On one hand, David had Moabite ancestry through his great-grandmother Ruth. On the other, his actions as king against Moab were among the harshest recorded in the Bible. This family connection manifested positively during the period when David was fleeing from King Saul. In 1 Samuel 22:3-4, we read that David sought refuge for his parents with the king of Moab. From there, David went to Mizpah of Moab and said, "To the king of Moab, please let my father and my mother stay with you until I know what God will do for me." And he brought them before the king of Moab, and they stayed with him all the time that David was in the stronghold. This action suggests that David believed his ancestral connection with Moab could ensure protection for his parents while he was being pursued. The Moabite king appears to have agreed, possibly recognizing their blood ties or simply seeing a political opportunity in sheltering the enemy of the current Israelite king. However, David's relationship with Moab changed dramatically after he ascended to the throne of Israel. In 2 Samuel 8:2, we find a disturbing account. He also defeated the Moabites and made them lie down on the ground. He measured them with a rope, measuring 2 lengths of them to be put to death and 1 full length to be kept alive. And the Moabites became servants of David, bringing tribute. This method of partial execution, seemingly arbitrary but methodically planned, is one of the most severe episodes in David's military campaigns. Approximately 2/3 of the captured Moabite male population was executed, while the remaining third was spared, presumably to serve as laborers and ensure continued economic productivity under Israelite rule. David's military campaigns against Moab likely had multiple strategic objectives: expanding Israelite territory east of the Jordan, securing control over key trade routes, and eliminating a potential threat to the eastern borders of his kingdom. The success of these campaigns is evidenced by the fact that Moab was reduced to vassal status, obligated to pay regular tributes to Israel. The implementation of these tributes represented a complete political and economic subjugation. Previously independent, the Moabites were now forced to send a portion of their agricultural produce, livestock, minerals, and other resources to Israel, weakening their own economy while enriching David's kingdom. The reasons behind David's hostility toward Moab, despite his Moabite lineage, remain a subject of debate among scholars. Some later Jewish traditions suggest that the king of Moab betrayed David's trust and murdered his parents, who were under his protection, but the Bible does not mention such an incident. Others propose purely political and military motivations without a personal component. What is certain is that David's actions established a period of Israelite domination over Moab that lasted until the end of his reign and that of his son Solomon. During this time, Moab existed primarily as a tributary state, with limited internal autonomy and fully subordinated to Israel's political and economic interests. After Solomon's death, the United Kingdom of Israel split into 2, the northern kingdom, Israel, and the southern kingdom, Judah. This division significantly weakened Israelite power in the region and created new political dynamics that the Moabites would eventually exploit to regain their independence. Moab's relations with the divided kingdoms were complex and variable. Geographically, Moab primarily bordered the northern kingdom, making it its main antagonist for most of this period. However, at different times, Moab also clashed with or formed alliances with the southern kingdom, depending on political and military circumstances. One of the most significant episodes in Moabite history during this period involved King Mesha, who ruled Moab around the 9th century BCE. According to 2 Kings 3:4-5, Mesha, king of Moab, was a sheep breeder and used to pay the king of Israel 100,000 lambs and the wool of 100,000 rams. But after Ahab's death, the king of Moab rebelled against the king of Israel. Mesha's rebellion against Israelite domination is notable not only because of the biblical account, but also because we have a historical record from Mesha himself, the famous Moabite stone, Mesha Stele, discovered in 1868 in Dibon, ancient Dibon. This basalt stele contains an inscription celebrating Mesha's victorious rebellion against Israel and his subsequent reconstruction of Moabite cities. In the stele, Mesha attributes his victories to the god Chemosh and describes how he reclaimed territories previously taken by Omri, king of Israel, and his son. He specifically mentions the capture of the city of Nebo, where he claims to have massacred its inhabitants as a sacrifice to Chemosh. The inscription also details his construction projects, including roads, cisterns, and fortifications. The Mesa rebellion provoked a coordinated military response. According to 2 Kings 3, Joram, king of Israel, formed an alliance with Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, and the king of Edom to suppress the Moabite rebellion. Initially, this coalition was successful, devastating Moabite cities and cornering Mesha in the fortified city of Kir-Hareseth. At this critical moment, one of the most disturbing episodes in Moabite history took place. Mesha, desperate and facing imminent defeat, took his firstborn son, who was to reign in his place, and offered him as a burnt offering on the wall. 2 Kings 3:27. This human sacrifice, performed in full view of the besieging armies, had a profound psychological impact. There was great indignation against Israel, so they withdrew from him and returned to their own land. The exact nature of this great indignation has been the subject of various interpretations. Some suggest that the Israelites were horrified by the sacrifice and preferred to abandon the siege rather than provoke further atrocities of this kind. Others propose that the Israelites feared the wrath of Chemosh, the Moabite god, after such an extreme sacrifice. Regardless of the correct interpretation, the outcome was that Mesha managed to preserve Moab's independence, at least temporarily. In the following centuries, Moab continued to exist as an independent kingdom, though often overshadowed by larger regional powers such as Israel, Judah, Damascus, and eventually the Assyrian and Babylonian empires. Its history during this period is marked by brief moments of autonomy, interspersed with periods of subjugation to more powerful neighbors. Several biblical prophets pronounced specific oracles concerning Moab, generally characterized by severe judgments but occasionally offering glimpses of future mercy. These prophetic pronouncements provide important insights into how the Israelites viewed their Moabite neighbors and what behaviors were considered particularly offensive to God. Isaiah dedicates a significant section of his prophecy, chapters 15 and 16, to an oracle against Moab. His tone is surprisingly empathetic at times, describing in detail the suffering that would come upon Moabite cities. Therefore the Moabites wail for Moab, all of them wail. Over the raisin cakes of Kir-Hareseth they sigh, utterly stricken. Isaiah 16:7. However, Isaiah clearly identifies the cause of divine judgment. We have heard of the pride of Moab, how proud he is, of his arrogance, his pride, and his fury. His boastings are false. Isaiah 16:6. Moab's national pride, manifested in its arrogance toward Israel and Yahweh, is presented as the root of its condemnation. Jeremiah also prophesies extensively about Moab in chapter 48. His oracle begins with a solemn declaration. This is what the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, says, "Woe to Nebo, for it is devastated." The prophet goes on to vividly describe the destruction that would come upon Moabite cities and the lamentation that would follow. Like Isaiah, Jeremiah identifies pride as Moab's primary sin. Since you trust in your deeds and riches, you too will be taken captive. Jeremiah 48:7. He also mentions Moab's contempt for Israel and its reliance on wealth and fortifications as reasons for divine judgment. However, Jeremiah's oracle concludes with a surprising note of hope. "Yet I will restore the fortunes of Moab in the latter days, declares the Lord." Jeremiah 48:47. This promise of eventual restoration, even for a traditional enemy like Moab, reflects the prophetic conviction that divine mercy ultimately extends to all nations. Ezekiel briefly mentions Moab in chapter 25, grouping it with the Ammonites, Edomites, and Philistines as peoples who rejoiced over the fall of Jerusalem and would therefore face divine judgment. The prophet declares that God will execute terrible judgments upon Moab, so that they will know that he is the Lord. Amos, one of the earliest writing prophets, includes Moab in his series of oracles against neighboring nations, Amos 2:1-3. He specifies that Moab's judgment comes because he burned to lime the bones of the king of Edom, a reference to some act of extreme brutality or posthumous disrespect, condemned as a violation of basic human norms. In all these prophecies, pride and arrogance consistently appear as Moab's central sins. This pride manifested in various ways: excessive confidence in its fortifications and wealth, contempt for Israel and its God, and malicious joy at the calamities that befell Judah and Israel. It is worth noting that some of these prophecies contain promises of future restoration, suggesting that, in the Israelite prophetic vision, even traditional enemies like Moab could eventually be reintegrated into the restored divine order. This tension between severe judgment and eventual mercy is characteristic of the prophetic message in general. The historical fulfillment of these prophecies is generally associated with the Assyrian and Babylonian invasions that devastated the region between the 8th and 6th centuries BC. Particularly significant was Nebuchadnezzar's campaign, which, after subjugating Judah, also conquered the neighboring nations, including Moab, as foretold by the prophets. The decline and eventual disappearance of Moab as a distinct political and cultural entity was a gradual process that culminated with the Babylonian invasions of the 6th century BC. The Bible does not record a specific moment of Moab's fall, reflecting the gradual nature of this process. When Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, expanded his empire throughout the Levant, Moab, like other small nations, lacked the military power to resist. Historical and archaeological evidence indicates that Moabite cities were conquered, and many were destroyed during the Babylonian campaigns, as predicted by the prophets. The Babylonian conquest effectively marked the end of Moab's political independence. Just as with Judah, it is likely that part of the Moabite elite was deported to Babylon, further fragmenting the nation's social and political structure. Major cities were either destroyed or significantly depopulated, and the administrative system that once characterized the Moabite kingdom was dismantled. In the centuries that followed, under the Persian, Greek, and Roman empires, the region that once constituted Moab was administered as part of larger provincial units. The distinct political identity of the Moabites disappeared, and gradually their cultural and ethnic identity also began to fade. This process of cultural and ethnic absorption by neighboring peoples accelerated after the Babylonian conquest. Without the political and religious structures that had maintained their distinct identity, the remaining Moabites were gradually assimilated by the Edomites, Arabs, returning Jewish exiles, and later by the Nabateans, who became dominant in the region. By the Roman period, the Moabites had disappeared as a distinct national identity. Writers from that time, such as Josephus, refer to the Moabites mainly as a historical people, no longer existing as a recognizable ethnic group. The land formerly known as Moab came to be referred to by geographic or administrative designations, with no reference to the former nationality of its inhabitants. Archaeological evidence confirms this decline. Excavations in ancient Moabite cities such as Dibon and Aroer show signs of destruction corresponding to the Babylonian period, followed by either greatly reduced occupation or abandonment. In other locations, evidence suggests a continued population presence, but with significant changes in material culture, indicating an influx of new ethnic groups and the loss of distinctly Moabite traditions. Despite their disappearance as a nation, the Moabite cultural heritage left lasting marks on the region. Elements of their language, religion, and cultural practices were absorbed by subsequent populations. More significantly, through Ruth and her descendants leading to David and beyond, the Moabites left a permanent imprint on biblical history and, for those who accept the Christian narrative, even in the very lineage of the Messiah. The spiritual and historical lessons from the rise and fall of Moab are manifold. For the ancient Israelites, Moab served as an example of the dangers of idolatry and national pride. Their history illustrated how nations that opposed God's people eventually faced judgment, but also how individuals like Ruth, who embraced the God of Israel, could be fully integrated into the covenant community. For modern readers, the story of the Moabites offers insights into how national and ethnic identities emerge, flourish, and may eventually disappear, into the complexities of intercultural relations, and into how, even amid historical hostilities, individual stories of reconciliation and integration can emerge, challenging larger narratives of conflict. The tragic story of the Moabites, from their troubled origins to their eventual disappearance, remains a powerful testament to the complexity of the human experience as recorded in the pages of the Bible. It is an account that does not oversimplify issues of identity, conflict, and redemption, but instead presents them in all their richness and ambiguity. If you enjoyed this biblical journey and want to keep exploring the fascinating stories of Scripture with us, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Click the subscription button now and turn on the notification bell to be alerted whenever we publish a new video. You can also help us spread these important biblical lessons by sharing this video with your friends, family, and faith community. Every share allows more people to discover the richness of biblical stories and their practical applications for our lives today. Leave a comment below telling us what stood out to you the most in this story of the Moabites and which other biblical stories you would like us to cover in our upcoming videos. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey. May God bless your walk of faith, and may we continue exploring the treasures of God's Word together.